My name's Kim. I'm really happy to welcome you all here today to the Center for Architecture and Design. And I always like to ask before we really get started, how many of you are in the architecture, design, construction, engineering field? All right. So I'm an anthropologist, but that looks like 30-40. We're not really good at math. But anyway, so how many of you are city employees? All right, you just don't want to show yourselves, I see. Any developers out there? No, all right. And property owners? Yeah, okay. And how many of you are just totally outside the world of architecture and development, but thought this would be a really interesting program? Cool, thank you for joining us. We try to do this for, for a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds. So I'm really excited that you decided to join us today. So yeah, here at the Center for Architecture and Design, we have 3 nonprofits. So once again, I am with the Seattle Architecture Foundation. We have AIA Seattle. We have Design in Public. And then there is, I guess a 4th, AIA Washington Council. So the Center for Architecture and Design is a dynamic space where we do exhibits, we do programs, and we try to have conversations about how architecture and design is shaping our city. This space is possible to the founding donors, and they're along the front wall underneath the beautiful element wood chandelier. I'd also like to thank our program sponsors, because without them, we wouldn't really be able to do this for free. So at the diamond level, we have Element Architects. MG2 is our platinum sponsor, and our gold level sponsors are Hargis Engineering INC, MacDonald Miller Facility Solutions, Morrison Harefield, and Skellinger Bender PS. And we also want to thank our grant maker for culture. But yeah, they really help us provide snacks, beverages for you, so that we can all just have, sit down and have a cool conversation. We are a nonprofit, and so a large portion of our revenue comes from our sponsors and members. I know a lot of you from the architecture engineering field, your firms are probably members. We thank you for that. If you aren't a member, we do a lot of cool things besides public presentations. We do a lot of walking tours, so just check us out online, see if it's something you want to be involved in. Anyway, the purpose of tonight's panel, while we're all here, is to examine humans' symbiotic relationships with architecture, technology, sustainability, and how that dynamic will shape our future. So to get things started, please help me in welcoming our moderator, Weber Thompson Architect and Symbiosis Model Exhibit Committee Member, Noelle Galicia.
All right, thanks, Kim. So my name is Noelle Galicia. I've been a volunteer for SAF for 3 years in a row now, and recently this year I joined the board of directors, and I'm honored to be part of this wonderful organization that helps bring architecture, design, and Seattle's history, more accessible to the public. We have a great exhibit this year. Like Kim said, it centers on symbiosis, and the entries that you see on display right now explores the positive outcomes of interdependence, either with nature, technology, or the community. So tonight's discussion, we will focus on 3 entries that we've selected from the exhibit, and joining us tonight are Matthias Olt of DLR Group, presenting the Seattle Mass Timber Tower Project, Mona Zellers of Johnston Architects, presenting the SPU Ship Canal Water Quality Project, and Sarah Hassa of Schemato Workshop, presenting the Skagit and Adams Creek co-housing projects. So before we begin the question and answer, or the discussion, I'd like to hand over the mic to our presenters so they can give a brief introduction of themselves, their firm, and the project that they're presenting. And we will start with Sarah.
Hi, thank you for having us here today. The project that I'm presenting today is Adams Creek Co-Housing as well as Skagit Co-Housing. They're two projects that we have two videos that are on that monitor just to your left, around the corner. And so I'm an architect at Schemata Workshop. We're a small firm up in Capitol Hill. We have about 13 people. And our mission statement is to empower communities through architecture and design. And so the clients that we work with are mostly people who we think are creating positive spaces within our cities. So we have clients that fall under the umbrella of community. So we work with a lot of communities, social service providers, transit agencies, governmental agencies. We've done some neighborhood design guidelines, and co-housing is also under this umbrella. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today, this one typology. But we do think that all of these projects really create the ecosystem of a really livable and equitable city. So we think each of these is important, but the one we're focusing on more today is the more private home side. And so this is a little dark, but this is a still shot from our video. So I'm going to be talking about Adams Creek Co-Housing. This is a project in Hood River, Oregon. I worked as the project manager and project architect on this project. And so I wonder if we can get these lights dimmed down a little bit.
Can we?
Just to see the image. But so I'll walk you a little bit through the parts and pieces that make up a co-housing community. We have, back here in the back with the circle, back here we have 25 individual homes in 3 buildings that are either 2 or 3 stories high. And each of these private homes has a full kitchen, a full living room, a full dining room, and 1 to 3 bedrooms. And so we have 4 different unit plans for different family structures. And so where you see the circle, right there we have each of the units faces into what we call the community street. It's a pedestrian street. And the kitchen, each of the kitchens faces into the community street, so everybody has eyes on the community street, as well as there's a front porch that also faces the community street. So there's always some kind of visual interaction between every one of the neighbors. And so along the community street there are little nodes, little gathering nodes, little spaces to stop and pause and meet your neighbors. Along with these private spaces, we also have a lot of common spaces throughout the site. And so at the other end that you're not quite seeing, we do have a large community garden that everyone can plant and grow in. We also have a parking lot for car share vehicles. We have a workshop, and we have a lot of space for recreational equipment because we're in Hood River. And so up here to the front where you see this lit up porch, we have the common house, which is the heart of a co-housing community. So this is where everyone in the community comes together 3 times a week to eat dinner. There are also laundry facilities for those who choose to use the communal laundry. There's mail, there's a gym, there is a kids' playroom, there's a living room. And so each of these spaces are the ones that we identified with the community members as being the spaces that they think are the social spaces, the spaces that they think they're going to be using the most, where they want to be interacting with their neighbors. And so they're very intentionally designed daily interactions to create that social capital between your neighbors. And so the intention is for this community to be net zero and to be made of quality materials, just because this is going to be their long-term home and they want to build it out of quality things. So, next slide, please.
Yep.
And so when we think about co-housing, I think the main tenet is that it's an intentional community where everybody knows that they're coming together to live together. We're gonna be interdependent. We are gonna rely on each other. Like that's the whole point. In this society where everything is being designed that we all don't need to be interacting with each other anymore, this is intentionally being designed that we have to interact with each other. So we're kind of creating those social tools to be able to come together. So these are just some images of some co-housing communities around North America. This is an image of us working with the community to talk about some of the materials. And so we've gone through a series of very intense programming workshops with them, kind of a participatory co-design process over the last 6 months, where we teach them like what we think they could use, but then they tell us, they're the experts in their lives, so they tell us what they want, what their social values are, what their community values are, and we take that into account. And so that's co-housing in a nutshell, and this is one example of it that we're working on in Hood River.
Great. Matthias?
My name is Matthias Old. Thanks for being here. What we have not discussed at the beginning, but what we wanted to share with you, just as an obvious, is as we go through the presentations and the panel tonight, we encourage all of you to ask questions, to interrupt us, to make it more relevant to the purpose that brings you here. So please don't hold back and share any thoughts or questions as it arises. I have been part of a team, a DLR group in Seattle, to work on yet another project that seeks to figure out how to do timber in taller buildings. We call that mass timber. Mass timber stands for ideologically engineered wood, and we have built a few of those projects around the country, and we're now doing the obvious, namely trying to figure out how to place it in the core of the Pacific Northwest, or what we consider with pride the center of it all here in Seattle and surroundings. It is a building material that the International Building Code will officially adopt next year, by the end of next year, for the IBC 2021, that's the code regulation. And the allowance will be to go up to 18 stories tall. The building that you're looking at here is a 12-story mixed-use building. It comprises of hotels, 6 floors of hotels, over 5 floors of offices, over retail, street-level podium. And the overall challenge here, this is a study that is the result of a few engineers and architectural and design firms getting together and trying to figure out how to position this for the marketplace, how to position this for Seattle, how to make it enticing for developers, how to catch traction within the economy, and we're going to talk a little bit about that further. But this is to say, it is a pure speculative pursuit. We don't have a paying client for it. We have people who are very ambitious, very passionate, very driven and on, and who want to figure out how to do this. And as a result of this, we now get more and more traction with local developers here in town. The site that we picked is across from Denny Park. It has a atrium spine that you can see here in the center of the building that opens to the north to the park, away from solar implications, and offers, similar to what Sarah just explained to you, those places and spaces that offer opportunities for encounter. We have the hotel lounges that are part of those atria on the upper floors for the hotel, and then the what we call the tech rooms for the offices as collaborative breakout areas for office environments, for a tech clientele, the tech tenants that we see within this region here. So we're right next to South Lake Union, and as you know, South Lake Union being the epicenter of everything that currently drives West Coast, but also national economy at significant scales. All those companies have a high need for highly flexible, attractive, and emphasis here is on attraction, workspaces. Next, please. We don't have good words for design, and this is a placeholder to say this is for North America a new undertaking to build with what we call glulam beams, or heavy timber beams, engineered wood floor assemblies, and glulam columns, those building components and blocks we are not that fluent in, and here's an opportunity to figure out how to drive a new language for all sorts of uses. How do you build a mass timber building for multifamily residential, or for hotel, or for office? How do they differ? What are the specific advantages and strategies for each of those program users to use the material to its best and most purposeful and most effective and funnest way? In those examples here, so we looked at finger jointing from the furniture industry to see if there's any value to bring that at an aspirational place into the facade making. We engaged with Martha Schwartz, a reputable landscape architect that most of you probably know in Brooklyn, and had her team up with us to come up with a landscape architecture and landscape design language that is conducive to the material of wood, of trees. And of course, we're all excited to do this here in Seattle, where we have mountains and waters and industries that support us. Next. And this is not just a design study, but then also, of course, a constructability and cost study. So we worked with Swinnerton Builders, who is a general contractor who has built mass timber buildings and knows numbers inside out on the West Coast, to help us on this project with constructability review, but then also with the cost estimation. And in a nutshell, those two item lines here matter most. So this is the comparison between mass timber and PT concrete, and these are the square foot cost in 2018 for that proposition. So what the contractor did is he modeled the entire building not only in timber as a cost model, but also in PT concrete. Same geometry, same volume, same height, same everything, just different material. And the takeaway here is that the construction costs of mass timber, but then also comparative to steel and concrete, are within range of each other and very, very close, and certainly for our market here. That is the second project of the projects we're going to be looking at today. Yes?
Hi, so I'm noticing that the real difference here is coming from the project overhead. Can you tell me what the difference is there?
Yes. So, great question. Project overhead is basically the money that is spent by the contractor during construction, and the uptick in the premium for a mass timber building is the cost of the material. It is higher than the cost of steel or concrete volumetrically. However, because it is pre-manufactured and prefabricated off-site in a factory and then shipped on site and popped in place, it goes together much faster. So the savings here in the general conditions are a result of a reduced construction schedule, reduced construction timeline, where 12 stories in Seattle currently take around 22 to 24 months to build. The experience and proposition here, for example, by Swinnerton Builders was that we could shave this down by 5 months to approximately 18 months. So it's the time savings on site, getting them in and out of site faster comparatively, which leads them to a bottom line wash.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mona Zellers. I'm with Johnston Architects. We are a 30-ish person firm in North Lake Union. We do a lot of multifamily, a lot of single family and commercial and mixed use. and public. And the project that I'm going to talk about today is actually an infrastructure project. You can go ahead and change. So to explain this project, I have to zoom out to the city scale and talk about history a little bit. So about 100 years ago, around 1900, when Seattle was designing and building its sewer system, it designed a combined system for both sewage and stormwater. So that's totally fine in most cases, but in a heavy rain, that is problematic because the sewer system can't handle the overflow that the stormwater brings. And so that all of that polluted water ends up, it's about 90% stormwater and 10% sewage, ends up overflowing into our local water bodies. So Puget Sound, the Ship Canal, Lake Union, Lake Washington, and the Duwamish. So Seattle Public Utilities has undertaken a couple of massive infrastructure projects to try and mitigate this problem. And the biggest of those is called the Ship Canal Water Quality Project. It's actually the largest project that SPU has ever undertaken. It's about $500 million. And essentially, it's an 18-foot diameter tunnel that runs underneath the Burt-Gilman Trail from basically from Fremont to Ballard, and it ends in Ballard at a 100-foot deep well. And so the idea is that during a storm event, all of that overflow water, which would normally go into Puget Sound, ends up in this tunnel and then travels to Ballard, and there's an effluent waterfall into the 100-foot deep tunnel. I'm going to try and say effluent a couple more times. So, and then so it ends in this well, and then it gets pumped to the West Point wastewater treatment facility when the storm has cleared up. So that pump station in Ballard is the only piece of the entire system that is actually above grade and that people can see. And so that's where Johnston Architects comes in. We are designing the pump station. So you can go to the next. So this image actually shows both phases of a two-phase project. The first phase and the critical phase that houses the actual pump station is the tower there that you can see. And it's essentially, so it's located on the, at the intersection of 24th Avenue Northwest and Shilshole. So it's right at the waterfront in Ballard, if you know where that is. It's right next to Packfish. It's a 65-foot tower. The well itself is circular. And so the pump station is just an extrusion of that circular shape up 65 feet, and it houses all this pump equipment. And it's clad in a stainless steel space frame that has integrated LED lights. And those LED lights are programmed so that during storm events, you would be able to see changes on the cladding of this building. So for instance, during a really heavy storm, there would be a lot of lights flickering and shimmering, and then during calmer times, less lights. There's also a street end here, 24th Avenue Northwest, and a public pier, and it's only one of two public piers or public access to the water in Ballard. So it's very important to also reinforce that connection, because if you've been to Ballard, you know that there aren't very many easy ways to get down to the water or experience the water from Ballard. Go ahead. So this is some experiments we have been doing on the tower frame, trying to figure out what exactly it's made out of and how it goes together. You can go to the next one. And here's a rendering of what it might look like. The low building in the foreground is the second phase, which may or may not happen, which is an event space, and also kind of a public walkway that is elevated that comes from grade and then up and then connects back to the waterfront.
Great. Thank you all. That was great. Really great projects. So we will start off with some project-specific questions and then end with some high-level questions at the end of the discussion. And again, feel free to interject. We want this to be an informal discussion tonight. So the Center for Architecture and Design was created to leverage expertise and resources that celebrate the power of design, advocate for policies affecting the built environment, and examine ideas to help Seattle meet the challenges it faces. Climate change, migration, homelessness, and food and water scarcity are some of the burning issues the world is facing in our lifetime and beyond. Your contribution belongs to a growing number of projects that seek to respond to social and environmental issues with a specific design solution. Can you frame or discuss the issues that your project is trying to tackle and explain how your design is part of a solution to a broader problem? Let's start with Matthias.
Matthias, do you want this one? Yeah.
Framing the problem. As we all know, joint sentiment, if I look at the faces here, is that climate change is upon us, and climate change, at least for those who live in Seattle, is real. And one of the outpost manifests that's there for us as architects in our firm working on projects is that we have to retake the seat that puts the person into the driver's seat for innovation on projects. And when I say innovation, I'm speaking reactionarily also in terms of the changes in behavior of people who use our buildings. We are speaking of automation, and we are speaking of overall the digitalization of our world over the last 20 years. And we can look at this sadly and regressively and just let it go, or we can take it on as a challenge to figure out how to improve the part of the world that we with our work can improve on. And along those lines, mass timber comes up, as you all know, more and more often as a curiosity or as a specific proposition to figure out how to challenge the way we have been thinking about buildings, and we will be thinking about buildings going forward. And what we have found with mass timber, as we just explained, was that there is, of course, from a client perspective, from a building, from a property owner perspective, the person who has to pay for this all, the advantage of the market that is currently in regions like Seattle or Vancouver, BC, or Portland, that is playing to our favor. By that I mean that the cost is competitive. The cost is competitive because the schedule is shorter, as we discussed. And contributing to that exercise of cost evaluation as well is the realization that the labor shortage, the acute labor shortage in cities of contractors not being able to find labor on site, that problem can be extracted and shifted onto the factory floor of a prefabrication plant. So if I can reduce my need for on-site labor by a significant amount, and mass timber does this compared to concrete or steel, by prefabricating it, then I have taken that labor shortage and quality insurance risk out of the equation. From a user's perspective, so this was the perspective of the guy who has to pay for it, the perspective of the person who's actually taking or experiencing the building itself. We know of the health benefits that are associated with mass timber or with all things natural. We know of biophilia. We know that we have as humans an affinity to things that are more on the natural than the synthetic side of things. And the This is all to say, if you look into the mirror and you imagine what you and what your kids will want in the future, it will be a building that has a more sustainable footprint in general in the world, and that's what's out there.
Yes, sorry, quick question. So it looks like it's a type 4B
Yes.
building type. How much of the wood, the actual natural wood, are you actually able to keep exposed in that style of building?
That's a great question, and the quick answer is none. So they're exposed. So I have to recap. So by expose, I was answering to exposing to the exterior environment. Was that your question, or was exposed on the inside?
Actually, inside mostly.
Okay. 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 Got it. Okay. So just to finish the sentence, mass timber on the outside of a building is and remains a problem for issues of weather and moisture and everything else that you know of wood. On the inside, and you stated that correctly, type 4B is the convolution of the code that says you can go up to 12 stories, and now you have to conceal 80% of the floor area equivalent on the ceiling, so you can leave 20% exposed on the ceiling. On the walls, you need to conceal 60% of the floor plan equivalent, so 40% you have to play with to show wood on the walls, and beyond that you need to encapsulate with 2 layers of 5/8 gypsum wallboard. That is for type 4B. It gets more stringent as you go beyond 12 floors. Yes?
You did a pretty detailed cost comparison in terms of constructing it. Would you do a comparison of embodied energy and how do those two compare?
Great question. So, speaking of climate change, if you compare the CO2, the carbon dioxide emissions that is needed to source, harvest, and or manufacture, transport to the site and put it in place, if you take the full circle of what's involved from zero to putting it into the building, and you run a CO2 balance, you will find that the mass timber building will be 45% less CO2 emitting than a comparable volume location site of concrete or steel. And those are fairly hard numbers. We have, in our office, we have engineers. We have engineers who do nothing else but environmental engineering for those type of concerns and analysis, and know from other adjacent industries that is a reasonable assumption.
Great, thank you, Matthias.
Okay, so the question was about what the issues are that the project is addressing, right?
Correct.
So for the pump station project, I think that there are 2 issues that project is addressing, and one is a very straightforward engineering problem, because we all know there are bad things that happen if we don't have clean water. Polluted water is connected to terrible diseases like cholera and typhoid. And so that's one very important thing that we need to address with this project. And I think in the face of climate change, there's a pretty direct correlation between so with climate change, we're seeing these much larger storm events, for instance, in this area. But we have an infrastructure system that's very rigidly designed and was never designed with this population in mind, and was never designed with any flexibility or ability to expand and contract and resiliently work with the natural system. And so now we're in a place where we're having to add back that flexibility into the system, add the resilience back into the system, because we're at this working within the space that's in between the built environment, the urban environment, and the ecology, and it's very intertwined, particularly in this project. And then the second issue that we're dealing with is how do you make people, the population, aware that they are entangled in this very complex urban ecological web? Because especially with plumbing, it's all underground. You don't ever really see it. So I think most people in the city don't understand that they're part of a watershed and that their street is sometimes a river, for instance. So how do you really make people aware of that in a different way? And I think that's the other thing that this project and other infrastructure projects actually in the city are trying to do. It seems like there's some momentum now. I'm thinking of the Denny substation as another example where architects and other designers are being brought in to really elevate that infrastructure and make it visible and make it somehow communicate what it's doing to the community.
We have a question over here.
Yeah.
Interested in the site. Why was that chosen pretty much downtown Ballard for this pump versus across the ship canal in Commodore Way where some of the industrial? Isn't an effluent waterfall going to have some negative environmental impacts?
Well, the waterfall actually happens. Two parts to that question, but the waterfall actually is like fully contained. I like to say effluent waterfall because it evokes a very weird image. but really what it is that the tunnel, which is running, along the bottom, right along the ship canal there, is it hits the well. I think about 60 feet down. So it's very deep at that point when it hits the well. It's all happening underground. So that's never something that literally the public can see. So there's all of this equipment above. That's actually a lot of it is related to how to reduce the smell. The other piece of your question about the location, I actually don't know the complete answer because we came onto the project much after the location was chosen. They've been engineering this project for many, many years. So this is the final piece of it. But yeah, I also think that Seattle Public Utilities has owned that piece of land for a long time, and it's also been a nexus of drainage from North Ballard, and for some reason, it's the nexus of drainage also for Queen Anne. So there are existing pipes that run underneath the ship canal in that location. So I think it was strategic for that reason. Yeah?
So are these projects that have been in the works for, seems like decades, are these more reactionary, or are these going to be long-term solutions for the growing city?
I think that's a really good question. So in a way they are reactionary. So these are engineered solutions to create more capacity in the system, and on a certain level they were dictated by law. These have to be in place because the Department of Ecology has basically demanded that the city reduce the number of CSO events. They are hoping that these are going to be for long-term solutions. They're looking at climate forecasts and well into the future. But I think an important other piece of this project is that the innovative green stormwater infrastructure work that SPU is doing. So kind of in coordination with this project, they're also trying to, I'm sure you may know this, but almost every development project that happens in the city now includes green stormwater infrastructure. And I think if you were to ask them, they would say, you know, our hope is that every street be lined with green stormwater infrastructure, every roof have green roof, and then you don't even really need this well. This system is actually secondary and a backup system.
Yeah, we have one more question.
Can you talk about the environment? How are the lights powered on LED system? And if you're relating green environment to the project, doesn't that contradict the purpose if you're spending more electricity and more power generating the light system?
So we're looking into all sorts of ways of powering the system, and I should also say we're fairly early on in the project, so this could change, but we're talking about, you know, potentially using solar that's mounted on the tower, so we wouldn't be drawing electricity from other sources. And then they are LEDs, so they're fairly low powered to begin with.
I understand that there's a lot of auxiliary projects that kind of support the additional capacity that you're adding, but the project is a standalone project alone. How much additional capacity do you think would be added to the system?
Okay, so the tunnel itself can hold 29 million gallons of water at one time. And the estimate is that roughly 75 million, at least 75 million gallons of polluted water per year would be treated in this way.
What's the per person output? So in terms of population, what are we talking about? We frame
Like the amount of stormwater per person in the city?
Oh, sorry.
I don't know.
You know how like when you build additional housing, there's additional runoff.
Right.
So what's the additional population that it would be supporting in terms of like additional infrastructure and additional runoff from such projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're hoping that this system, in addition to those other auxiliary systems, would be able to handle the population growth that's expected 50, 100 years more into the future.
Great, any more questions for Mona? All right, thank you, Mona.
So the issue that I guess co-housing is addressing in general is the disconnection, I think, that we're all feeling in our modern society, at least here in North America. In modern culture, you know, the old American dream that's been sold to us in the last 60, 70 years about the single family standalone home with the fences around it, where you drive up to your front door, you can drive all the way up to your corner office with the walls around it, where you can work on your computer and you can, you know, all of your automated messages will, you know, everything is automated. You never have to talk to another person. You probably want more things that can, like, have you talk to people even less. And so we're all feeling this isolation. There's more mental illnesses diagnosed every day in this country, and I think co-housing is kind of a direct antidote or a direct response to that, where people are seeing a need to reconnect in village type formats that we have lived in since kind of the dawn of time. And so co-housing specifically, our project, 25 families are coming together to live on 2.5 acres rather than on half an acre each. Everyone is sharing more of their resources. Not everyone has to have a car, not everyone has to have a garden, not everyone has to have guest bedrooms. There's guest bedrooms in the common house. So there's so many more shared things. So there's just like less need for certain things that maybe you're only using once a year, but you have in your own home, and every single one of those 25 families has that same like guest room that they only use once a year. And so this is a solution to a growing population throughout the world, and people coming together to try to live together abundantly and efficiently and sustainably and resiliently. The more we know our neighbors, the more we're able to overcome challenges that we're going to be facing in the future too. Yeah.
Question for Sarah.
I feel like this co-housing is also addressing the problem of like affordability housing. Like, you can't go with friends to be able to hire an architect and build a sweet house, which you wouldn't be able to do by yourself.
I think that's the idea. Right now, co-housing is only about 25 years old in the United States. And so there's a lot of systems that are kind of built up against it in terms of financing models, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's only a very privileged population that's able to kind of attain it right now. I think there's a lot of awareness around that, and people are trying to make it more of an affordable solution. And we are having discussions within the community about how to make that more affordable for lower income populations and things like that. But yeah, I think in general it is still fairly affordable, I think, for middle class. But there are discussions about how to make it more affordable in general. Yeah.
Did you have to have a certain amount of buy-in from a certain amount of families to get this going, or is it completely developer driven?
It depends on the community and exactly what structure they have within them. Right now, there are 15 of the 25 families are committed. Committed. About, I think, 6 of them right now are, they're fully committed. They have money in, and then the others pay certain money in right now. But they are working with a developer as well. And so they're very tight on their costs and very specific, and it is very much dependent on who is buying.
Follow up to that. Do they have much say in the design, or is it still, if you're buying into a project, you're going to want your specific individual unit to be somewhat expressed of yourself, or are they buying into the idea that there's certain packages? I was just curious how it's all functioning as a project.
Everyone has the same say. Everything is done by consensus, with knowing that each of these families has an equal share. It doesn't matter how much more money you're putting in. We are all one community, and we're going to do this together. And so we consider everybody who's there equal. And so every direction that they give to the designers is reached by consensus.
So what do you see as the key differences between sort of this co-housing model versus like a condominiums HOA type of community that is maybe similarly designed?
Mm-hmm.
You know, common spaces and, you know, single homes.
It's the intention behind it. So a lot of times, yes, the architecture will look very similar to multifamily buildings, but it's about the community and how much they're willing to invest. Like, these people have been together for quite some time. They have committee meetings like 2 or 3 times a week. They come together and they decide everything by consensus. And so in that way, it's really about that commitment to live collaboratively and to show up and share resources. And in that way, like, every decision that they make is very much based around their shared values. So they come together all the time to define their shared values, as well as make decisions for each other. Actually, you come to trust the people in the community that you're living with. I mean, there's families that, like, for example, the co-housing community that we designed in Capitol Hill, there is an elderly couple there. They take a lot of the kids. There's like 9 families in there, and so the elderly couple, they take the children from like 4 of the households to school every day together, and so there's this like very closeness and awareness of living collaboratively, very intentionally. I think that's how it differs from an HOA condo association.
We have one more question in the back.
So you keep referencing this word community, and I'm just curious what that actually means in your project, because you mentioned a neighborhood that I live in and a project that you know of there, and I don't know anything about it. And that's my community, and so I'm just curious, what community are you talking about? Is it friends that are just like, hey, let's build a house together, or families, or is it the true community in which that neighborhood is residing?
So when I'm using the word community, it's the co-housing community. So it's those 25 families or the 9 families in Capitol Hill that have decided to come together to build this co-housing community. So they all live on one property together in one building on Capitol Hill. It's on 12th. And so that's how I'm using the word. I know there's very many different scales of community here, but for this project, it's the community of those families that are coming together intentionally to live together.
One more over here.
Are you playing a role in the social equity that the families take in it, or do they kind of come to you prior to your involvement, having agreed to support each other, you know, when one is low and one is high? Or are you trying to facilitate the way they're going to be living in the co-housing community?
I think in terms of the architecture, we're trying to design spaces that are accessible to everybody within the community. And in that way, trying to take into account every different person that could be living in this community. For example, during the programming workshops, we do have these other personas that we hand out to everybody in the community for that signify people who could potentially be joining the community later. And so we have like a persona of somebody who is not represented within the 15 families that are already in the community. And so we try to pick people from different backgrounds and different ages, different income levels, and so have them think about the different types of people that are going to be living within it. And then if they don't feel like that person's being represented by the voices that are in the room that day, they should be speaking up. And we're trying to be conscious of that too. Like our designs, we try to design to that, but we also want them to understand the concepts behind it. So a lot of these programming workshops are us very much being very transparent about our process and trying to get them in the same mindset that we are, so that they fully understand the design in the same way that we do, and so that they're then able to take ownership of the design and then share that information with anybody who's coming in new and any guests, so that like the design advocacy doesn't stop with us. It goes to the client, and then they can pass it on and pass it on and pass it on. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
There's one more question in the back.
This one's quick, but is the community on 12 the same one that the schematic office is at the ground level of?
Yes.
The same building?
Mm-hmm.
And so follow-up question to that, is that kind of like an experiment? Do you have any interactions now that that project is built, and kind of can you use that community to inform the secondary community?
Absolutely. We actually have 2 of our principals live in that community upstairs. So that's been really helpful for us because we know, exactly what happens in co-housing because people live in it every day, and I think that really strengthens the way that we interact and design our buildings because we can understand exactly, actually no, people are never going to interact in that way, like this is how this happens, this is where conflict happens, so it very much informs it, yes.
Great, so follow-up question to the first question. So looking ahead, what do you think is the future, or what is the impact of your project 10 to 15 years from now? Like what is the future of co-housing look like? What does the future of our waterways look like? And what does the future of mass timber look like? So let's start with Sarah.
I think I want to talk specifically about this project, actually. So there's there's a bunch of kids that we're working with in Adams Creek, and so there's I'll talk about Jonah and Ella. I think in 15 years they're going to be around the age of 18 to 20, and they'll be kind of thinking about what are their next steps in life. Maybe one of them is going to go tour South America. One of them is going to go, go to cooking school in France. One of them is going to go to university. One's going to stay home and take care of a sick parent. And so I think what's really exciting to me about co-housing is that each one of them has seen 25 other ways of living very, very closely throughout their time within the co-housing community. They haven't just seen like 2 ways of living, their parents. And so they're able to kind of understand different cultures. They are able to understand different ways of living like very closely. Like every day they're interacting with different people, much more closely than I think they would if they were living in their single family home and not knowing their neighbors very well. And they're not conflict averse. They were living with 25 other families. They're gonna have disagreements and they're gonna have to solve them because they live with these people every day. And so I think the potentials of co-housing that I've seen and I know of are just that the progression of these children throughout the co-housing community, I think, is a really great way for people to grow. So that's specific to the co-housing community. In about 15 years, I think that's what I see for it. In terms of co-housing in general, right now, I think I talked a little bit about this earlier, but there's a very specific demographic that is drawn to it. A lot of times it's people who are a bit older, a lot of people who are upper middle class, and there's a lot of white people who are in co-housing. And it's usually very suburban, but I think the interest that we've seen in it is a lot more urban, and a lot more millennials are starting to get interested. And so I think we'll see a lot more millennials come into it, a lot more urban co-housing communities, and I think we'll see a lot more senior co-housing communities as well. It's just a great way to age in place. And there's also been we've seen some interest in larger corporations who are interested in seeing how to monetize co-housing. So they're looking at master plans and huge like home building operations. But then they're like, well, maybe we can make one building co-housing. And so we've had some interest in people asking us about how to try and monetize it. And so potentially, I think there's a way to scale up, because right now I think it's very piecemeal. There's only 10 architects in the United States doing this, and so I think hopefully it's scaling up in the next 10 years.
I think I talked about this earlier, but I see this stormwater infrastructure project as one of a few projects in the city that are starting to elevate the consciousness of the infrastructure that keeps the city going by making it more visible to people. And so actually SPU, Seattle Public Utilities executive director is Mami Hara, who is trained as a landscape architect and urban planner. And so I think having her at the helm of this huge organization is very exciting, because she really cares about how we're integrating our infrastructure in a very conscious way that allows us to connect with it and allows for the potential of a new kind of ethic of place. So I'm hoping that this is part of kind of a gaining momentum for these infrastructure projects, and that we'll see more and more of them and in different ways in different parts of the city. Yeah.
This project that you're working on is treating the stormwater, the CSOs from North Seattle. Are there any concurrent projects that are treating stormwater for, say, the Duwamish or South Seattle?
There are several smaller projects in the city right now that are dealing with stormwater infrastructure, and they're both King County and Seattle heading those up, and they're just smaller. They're smaller projects, but they're basically the same type of project.
Great. Thanks, Mona.
So the question was the next 10, 15 years, and I keep staring over here and can't keep my eyes off the wall of the white cloud that's there. And somebody wrote in there under the title, "What are you willing to give up?" Somebody wrote the right to vote. Ouch. My answer to the question of the next 10 to 15 years, just looking at this, keeping that in mind, is I think we will need to be more accepting of more legislation that controls how we use resources, how we use water, how much water we can pollute, how much energy we use, how that energy is generated. And if you look at European countries, you get a flavor for what's out there and what's to come. So in Germany, my home country, just this week, the parliament will be voting for either cap and trade or put a cost on carbon, namely carbon tax, onto the industries. And I believe that in 10 years, that's my hope, for our profession, for the profession of architects, designers, but all industries, frankly, that there will be a mechanism to price pollution. And so what cap and trade does, just to quickly reiterate this, is that you as a low emitter can sell your allowances for CO2 emissions to somebody who has very high emissions as a matter of his or her industry. And overall, you're trying to keep the lid down by encouraging a demand and supply market for carbon emissions. The carbon taxes, you just price, you put a cost on the you put a cost on the energy use, and as such, you price the pollution itself. Those two are mechanisms that will, and this is just the energy sector, so I can imagine how that will work for the water sector, where you're being penalized if you are polluting beyond levels that legislation will need to set. And that's, in my view of the world, true for energy and for water, and I hope that the right to vote, what am I willing to give up? I hope that legislation will be out there and will entice industries to innovate and to look for clean energies and to look for new ways of doing things.
Thanks, Matthias. So this next question centers on society and culture and its relationship to technology. And I think Sarah may have touched on this a little bit. And as people become more reliant on technology, we have become more isolated from the things and people around us. So how can thoughtful design unify a community, reconnect people to nature, and foster interaction and meaningful relationships? So let's start with Sarah.
Yeah, I think co-housing tries to solve that in a way. I think for our project, what was really important is the concept of co-design and the participatory design process, and just making sure that everybody in the community has buy-in on everything that's going to be designed for them. And in that way, I think that answers the thoughtful portion of your question. We're coming in as experts of the built environment. We're going to throw out some suggestions and kind of let them know, this is going to help out here, but I think we also need to be very conscious of their limitations and what they're interested in. And in that way, it's kind of a give and take between us and the client.
Oh, in the back, let's start with you.
So I have a question about privacy. And in a world where we're constantly exposing ourselves through Instagram, social media, Facebook, etc., everything's being recorded and put into a database. How is co-housing taking this new definition of privacy and this new era of what it could mean and what it was and what it means today? Since you're in such a close proximity with other families, you're inevitably losing a lot of privacy on top of this continuous exposure within your cell phone.
I don't know if I think that we're losing privacy in these communities. There are spaces that we're designing completely private, all the way to completely public spaces within these communities. Every unit has its own everything that you need to be able to retreat and to have dinner with your own family. We do have back porches that are more private for the insular family. And so each unit does provide for a range of public to private tendencies. None of us is made the same. Like, some people are more introverted, some people are more extroverted. And so we do try and create spaces, also within the public spaces, for smaller nooks for you to come, and maybe it's just one-on-one, or maybe you're just alone, but there are spaces that we're designing that are made to be more quiet and more introspective. And then there are spaces that are more designed for more social spaces for interacting with other people. And so we're very conscious of the different types of people that are going to be living in there, and very much designing both the private and the public spaces for them. What they do with their social media, thank you, Matthias, is, it's up to them. They've decided, a lot of them are deciding not to put TVs in their spaces, but I think that's up to them, so I'm not sure I can answer that part of the question. But in terms of the architecture of the spaces, we're taking into account the different levels of privacy, public to private spectrum.
Sarah, you had mentioned that in the design, a lot of them were the kitchens were overlooking the actual meeting area. Was that so? There's a lot of cultures where the gathering place is the kitchen. Was that purposeful? Was that kind of one of the reasons you guys went?
Absolutely, yes. So in at least in Western culture, and most of the people that are going to be living in this community, we have put the kitchen at the forefront, and that is you can look into the space. And so the further back into the unit, the more private it becomes. So we have the kitchen in the front, then we have the dining, and then we have the living. There's other co-housing communities that actually separate the level of the living room lower or higher. And so there's also that vertical grade change that creates a little bit more privacy. And so then we have a little wing in the back. So the bedrooms are all in the back. And so we do have that public to private spectrum is a very clear diagram, like right out from that very public community street out to the back of the buildings, which are the private rooms.
What do you think the limit of the power of the architecture for solving the problems is? So I could see being very excited about going up to Anacortes and being part of a select group of the cream of the crop people to live off in our co-housing, but once we get to half of the world is living in co-housing and there's no cream of the crop anymore, can like normal people get along like that?
I think so. Yes. There's a point where the architecture is a tool that people have to choose to use it. So I think there's some power in it. We can definitely design spaces that are very anti-social. So we do have to use the power of architecture and design to create those spaces. But then I think if they're not willing to use them in the way that they're intended, that's up to them.
Okay. To answer your question, when you go into co-housing, you have to go in there knowing that you're not going to get everything that you want, which is kind of an American idealism, like that freedom to purchase and to make freedom and liberty of, like, I want to purchase this, I'm going to get this. Whereas in co-housing, you kind of go in there knowing that you're making decisions based on a collective society. And I will say that, like, I work with Sarah, and I will say that that's probably the hardest thing that we have to deal with when we do co-housing projects, is just that like everyone goes in there optimistic, and like we're talking about co-housing, and it seems like this ideal utopian dream, but then all of a sudden there's inevitably, like, you want something, someone else doesn't want it. How do we deal with it, and how do you make it so it's not a win-win situation? How do you make it so it's like a win-win situation? And I feel like as co-housing architects, we shoulder the role of psychologists a lot more than on a project where
to work with. So yeah, I would say co-housing can only go so far as a person's willingness to sacrifice their personal wants for the good of a society or good of a community, which is true of
yeah, it's like be a minimalist first and then go into co-housing. That's what it sounds like.
yeah. Or find your group and find your core people that have the same ideas.
It's so funny how a lot of the implementation, there's a lot of things involved. They're not just logistics. It's like psychology and the type of person.
It's not for everyone, for sure.
Yeah, but I would also say it's not sacrificing your individual needs. I think it's adapting what you think your individual needs are to understanding that you will be better off if the group is better off, too. So.
Do we have more questions for Sarah?
Yeah, last
All
one.
right.
Hopefully it's quick. I'm just curious about how you guys chose the size or the quantity of families that you're living there. I've seen a lot in Europe and stuff will have smaller ones for 6 families or 10 families, or even smaller. But how did you guys end up with 25?
The community and the developer work together to determine that. A lot of it is, the more families there are, the cheaper the units become. But the more families there are, the less interaction you have between every single person. And so it's a give and take, and they go back and forth. We started, the range was 20 to 35 units at one point, and then we do the site studies and understand how much is actually feasible on the site. And then the developer goes back and forth with pricing out the units, and so eventually, you start to narrow it down.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Oh, yes.
So we have maybe 8 minutes left, and we have so many juicy questions that I know we won't get to. So I have a request. Noelle, if you would choose randomly out of order one of the other questions, and if our lovely panelists can speed, and by speed, take a couple minutes,
All right.
speed answer them, just because they're
Totally.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut this short, but I will end with a high level sort of leave behind question for everybody. So, Greta Thunberg is a Swedish climate activist who in August 2018 and at age 15, she began spending her school days outside the Swedish parliament demanding immediate action to combat modern-day climate change. Now in the US, Thunberg is calling for a massive strike for climate change this Friday, September 20th. Meanwhile, we all commute by Uber, drink carbonated water from aluminum cans, and our newfound preference for online shopping leaves behind insurmountable piles of cardboard boxes and plastic waste, not to mention delivery planes, cars, and drivers for each consumer shipment. So the question is, from the perspective of a design professional seeking to leave the world better than you found it, what strategies or operational tools do you employ towards behavioral change? What do you need more of in order to be successful? Let's start with Matthias.
That's a fun one. I try to make it short. A quick story. So I have a 11-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 17-year-old, and a few weekends ago we sat with nothing to do, believe that, in the living room, trying to figure out what to do with the remaining hours of the Sunday. And we started to write up a list of things to do: go in the park, go swimming, go for a bike ride, play a puzzle, etc. And one of the options coming from my 11-year-old was nap. And we collected it all, we put it up on a chart, everybody got 3 votes, we voted through, it was non-conclusive, we figured we needed a different process. We looked for a spinning wheel, electronic spinning wheel of course, because the 15-year-old was involved, so we had a spinning wheel like this on the iPhone, and we put in the options, and the spinning wheel stopped at nap. And this is to say that if we, as a collective of people who live and breathe this city, if we don't choose very carefully what we want out of this city and out of our lives, then somebody else will choose for us an app that we might think will never happen, but this is exactly where the spinning wheel will stop. And so as far as behavioral change and methodology, architects are good at analyzing problems. They're good at developing a solution. What needs to come next, because we want to change this, right? What needs to come next then is we need to figure out how to improve our leadership. We need to give ourselves new tools to figure out how to lead, how to follow, how to play those back and forth. And then lastly, we need to figure out, we need to understand that the good is just not good enough. That it is not good, it will not do to say, I will do my best. It will be required to say, I will do whatever is needed to succeed and make this go forward. We need to push it hard, otherwise somebody else will elect for us.
Okay, I also have a story. I'm a podcast junkie, and I was listening to a podcast the other day about cities, and one of the really interesting things they were talking about was this fact that you would think that cities would be way more efficient because we're all kind of close together and we're using less, sewer lines per capita and less power lines per capita and less roads per capita. So we should be consuming less overall. But the truth is the inverse, that we actually, the bigger the city, the more we consume per capita. And I think part of the reason is because we stop being aware of all of the systems that are behind what we're consuming. So essentially we stop being aware of like how the sausage is made, and we just keep buying more sausage. And so I think, I've been hammering this over and over in this talk, but I think the more that we can make people aware of the systems that are invisible, that make our lives easier, but maybe cause problems in our environment, the better off we'll be, the closer we'll be to kind of a higher level of consciousness where we're able to make better decisions. Then the other thing I want to say about that is that people generally will do what's easier and makes them happy or is cheaper, right? I mean, just by default, we all kind of do that. But we as designers have this like kind of awesome power to change what is easier or what makes you happy. You can design solutions that that are the right thing to do, that make our environment better, that make this a better place to live. For instance, I have a problem with like coffee cups, collecting disposable coffee cups. They're always in my car. But like, if my coffee cup was also the key to my electric car, for instance, then I would always have a reusable coffee cup. And that's a ridiculous idea, like no one's gonna do that. But you get the point that, we have an ability to think about things differently and design a better future, I guess.
I think the only thing I'll add to that is that we do have a big power, and I think as designers and as architects, we also have power to advocate and to speak to our to our governments, and to use that power and our expertise to and leverage that and talk to those who have the power to make the laws that can be enforced to actually make these changes. I think the flip side of that is we also have to, we have to have laws that are being enforced, but I also think we have to create support for those who are not able to meet those high standards, and so we have to have systems in place to be able to make that happen for everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, Mona, and Matthias. Big round of applause for you. General questions, I would like to just mention we invite everyone to take a look at these questions on either side of the room, and we encourage you before you leave to write your thoughts on the thought cloud. And that said, the floor is open for questions.
I just want to say Matthias had a very hard stop at 7, and so if you have any questions, I'm happy to give you information and forward your information to him or whatnot. But yes.
Great. Questions? All right.
I was just curious if you ever considered using the waterfall as an energy source for your LED lights.
the effluent waterfall? I really like that idea. I'll look into it.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope everyone had fun.